The cavernous silence of the courtroom was a living thing, a coiled predator waiting to strike. I sat on the polished wooden bench, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles were white. Beside me, my mother, Elena, was a statue carved from fear, her gaze fixed on the empty witness stand. I squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile I didn't feel. "It will be okay, Mom," I whispered. "Mark will win. The truth is on our side." But was it? For the past 3 weeks, our lives had been a whirlwind of hushed conversations, legal documents spread across our dining table, and the strained, confident smile of my stepfather, Mark. He was suing his former business partner, a man named Julian Croft, for slander. Croft had publicly accused Mark of fraud, of being a monster in a tailored suit. To me, it was absurd. Mark was the man who had saved us. I was only 5 when my real father died in a tragic car accident, leaving my mother and me destitute. Then Mark appeared, a friend of my father's, a beacon of stability in our sea of grief. He provided for us, gave my mother a beautiful home, and raised me as his own daughter. He was charming, respected, a pillar of the community. Julian Croft was just a bitter, failed businessman trying to drag a good man down. That's what Mark told us. That's what I believed. My mother, however, had been different ever since the trial began. She barely slept, startled at every phone call, and her eyes held a haunted look I hadn't seen in years. I thought it was the stress of the trial, the fear of having our perfect life shattered by lies. Oh, how wrong I was. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed, and we stood as Judge Thompson entered, his face a mask of stern impartiality. Mark, sitting at the plaintiff's table, turned to give us a brief, confident nod. He looked impeccable in his navy suit, the very picture of wronged innocence. His lawyer, a sharp, silver-haired man named Peterson, began his opening statement, painting a portrait of Mark as a dedicated family man and an honest entrepreneur whose reputation was being maliciously destroyed. I watched, my heart swelling with pride and anger at the injustice. How could anyone believe Croft's lies? The first few hours of the trial went exactly as Peterson had planned. Witnesses testified to Mark's good character. Financial records were presented, seemingly proving his innocence. Julian Croft, sitting at the defense table, looked smaller and more desperate with each passing minute. My mother's hand in mine was ice cold, and she trembled almost imperceptibly. "It's almost over," I whispered, trying to soothe her. "See, they have no case." She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the prosecutor, a man named Daniel Davies, who had been observing the proceedings silently. He had been brought in because Croft's accusations had sparked a separate, state-level investigation into Mark's business practices, but so far, he had remained a quiet observer. Then, after the lunch recess, everything changed. "The prosecution would like to call a witness to the stand," Davies announced, his voice calm, but carrying an electric charge that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Prosecutor, this is a civil slander case," Judge Thompson said, looking over his glasses. "Your role here is observational unless criminal charges are filed." "Charges may be filed, Your Honor," Davies replied smoothly, "depending on the testimony of this next witness. I call Elena Petrenko to the stand." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Petrenko. That was my mother's maiden name, the name she hadn't used in almost 20 years. My mother froze, her face draining of all color. Mark shot a furious, panicked look first at my mother, then at his lawyer. Peterson jumped to his feet. "Objection. Mrs. Sterling's testimony has no bearing on this case. The prosecution is engaging in a fishing expedition." "On the contrary," Davies countered, his gaze never leaving my mother. "Her testimony is the only thing that matters. It speaks to the character of the man who claims he has been slandered. I believe she has a story to tell, a story she has been waiting 20 years to share." Judge Thompson looked at my mother's terrified face, then at the prosecutor's unwavering one. He was intrigued. "I'll allow it," he said, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "But be warned, prosecutor. This had better be relevant." My mother moved toward the witness stand as if in a trance. Every eye was on her. She looked so fragile, so small, as she took the oath. Mark stared at her, his jaw clenched, the confident facade cracking to reveal something cold and menacing underneath. Davies approached her gently. "Mrs. Sterling, or do you prefer Miss Petrenko?" "My name is Elena," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elena, he began, I want to take you back 20 years. To a time before you met Mr. Sterling. You were married to another man, weren't you? A man named Michael Petrenko. A tear traced a path down my mother's cheek. Yes, she breathed. And Michael Petrenko had a business partner, did he not? A very ambitious partner who was also his best friend. A man who was there the night your husband's car went off that bridge. My mother started to sob, a broken, wrenching sound that filled the silent room. Objection, Peterson shouted. This is irrelevant and cruel. Overruled, the judge said, his own eyes now fixed on my mother with a dawning horror. Davies moved closer, his voice dropping but his words sharp as daggers. Elena, look at the man sitting at that table. Look at your husband. Is he the man who saved you from your grief? My mother lifted her tear-streaked face and looked at Mark. Her expression was no longer one of fear. It was one of profound, soul-shattering agony. Then the prosecutor turned to the jury, his arm outstretched, his finger pointing directly at my stepfather. The courtroom fell dead silent. That man, Davies' voice boomed, is not her savior. He turned his gaze back to my mother. That is not her stepfather, he roared, his voice breaking with fury. That is her tormentor. My mother screamed. A raw, primal sound of pain and liberation that ripped through the heart of the courtroom's suffocating silence. But it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream born of a truth she had swallowed and hidden for 20 long years. A truth that was about to burn down everything I thought I knew about my life. And what happened next, in the echoing wake of that scream, would make even the judge fall silent, speechless before the abyss that had just opened up in his courtroom. My mother's scream was not just a sound. It was a fracture in reality. It tore through the courtroom's decorum, shattering 20 years of suffocating silence. For a moment, everyone was frozen. The jury, the reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks, even Judge Thompson. The predator of silence had struck, and its prey was the life I had always known. Mark was on his feet instantly, his face a mask of purple rage. This is a disgrace. An absolute circus. I will not have my wife subjected to this. This psychological torture. Peterson, his lawyer, echoed him, shouting, Your Honor, I demand a mistrial. The prosecution has turned this civil matter into a witch hunt. But my mother's scream hadn't ended. It had transformed into deep, ragged sobs. She was looking at Mark, but for the first time, it was not with the timid deference of a loving wife. It was with the terrified eyes of a prisoner who has just seen an open door. Order! Order! Judge Thompson's gavel hammered down, the sharp cracks finally cutting through the chaos. The room quieted, but the air remained thick with tension, heavy with the unsaid. The judge's gaze was hard, fixed on the prosecutor. Mr. Davies, you are on the thinnest of ice. Your accusation is of the most serious nature. You had better be able to substantiate it. Davies didn't flinch. He walked slowly back toward the witness stand, his expression softening as he looked at my mother. Elena, he said gently, his voice a stark contrast to the previous uproar. No one can force you to speak. But if you wish to, this court will listen. The truth has a right to be heard. He was giving her an out. He was giving her a choice. Mark stared at her from his table, his eyes like chips of ice, a silent, chilling command to stay quiet. I saw her look at him, and for a split second, she wavered. The fear, so deeply ingrained, pulled her back. She opened her mouth, and I was sure she would recant, apologize, say she was overwrought. But then, her eyes found mine. I was looking at her, my face a canvas of pure confusion and dawning horror. I, her daughter, the reason she had endured everything, was now the reason she had to speak. The sight of my shattered world seemed to give her a strength I had never seen before. She took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to the judge. I will speak, she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. Mark slumped back in his chair as if struck. Peterson threw his hands up in exasperation, and the courtroom leaned forward as one, ready to devour the secret that had been buried for 2 decades. Please, Elena, Davies said softly. Tell us about your first husband, Michael Petrenko. He was my everything, she began, her voice gaining strength with each word. He was a brilliant architect, kind, and so full of life. We had a small firm together. I handled the finances. He was the creative genius. And we had Maya, She smiled through her tears as she looked at me. She was his whole world. And Mark Sterling? Davies prompted. What was his role in your lives? He was Michael's best friend, she said, the words tasting like poison. They grew up together. Mark was the business mind. Michael trusted him completely. We all did. He was family. He was Uncle Mark to Maya. I flinched. I had no memory of this. My memories of Mark began after my father's death. Tell us about the business, Davies said. We were on the verge of something big, Elena explained. Michael had designed an innovative, eco-friendly community project. We had secured the land, the permits. All we needed was the final round of funding. Mark was in charge of negotiating with the investors. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. That's when things started to change. Mark started holding secret meetings. He told Michael the investors were getting cold feet, that they needed more collateral. He convinced Michael to sign over personal assets, even our home, to a holding company to secure the deal. Objection. Hearsay. Peterson shouted. It's not hearsay if she was the one signing the financial documents, Davies retorted. Were you not, Elena? Yes, she confirmed. I signed them. Michael trusted him, so I trusted him. I looked at Mark. His face was unreadable, a cold, marble mask. But I could see the frantic, desperate energy radiating from him. He was losing control, and it was driving him mad. And what happened to the project? Davies asked. It all fell apart, my mother whispered. 1 week, we were on the verge of success, and the next, we were ruined. Mark came to us and said the investors had pulled out. The holding company, which he controlled, called in the debt. We lost everything. The business, the house, our savings. Everything Michael had built was gone. The courtroom was utterly silent. This was the fraud Julian Croft had accused him of, but hearing it from my mother's lips gave it a terrifying new weight. Michael was destroyed, she continued, her voice breaking. He wasn't just bankrupt. He was broken. He felt like he had failed us. He started drinking. He became a ghost of the man he once was. Mark was there, of course. Always the supportive friend, telling him he'd help him get back on his feet. Davies let the silence hang in the air before asking his final, devastating question. Elena, he said, his voice laced with a terrible, quiet sorrow. Tell us about the night your husband died. My mother closed her eyes, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. It was raining, she began. Michael had been in a deep depression for weeks. That night, Mark came over. He said he had good news, a new opportunity. He took Michael out for a drive to clear his head. He said they were going to the old bridge, their favorite spot, to talk things over. She opened her eyes, and they were filled with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. An hour later, the police called. There had been an accident. The car had gone off the bridge. Michael was dead. Davies stood before her, his voice barely a whisper. And Mark Sterling? My mother's gaze shifted to the man who had been my father for most of my life. Her voice was steady now, cold and clear as a winter morning. He came back alone, with a few scratches and a perfectly rehearsed story about how my husband, in a drunken despair, had swerved the car off the road on purpose. He came back with our entire future in his hands. The courtroom felt like a vacuum, all the air sucked out by my mother's last words. He came back alone. The simplicity of the statement was more damning than any complex accusation. I stared at Mark, trying to see the man my mother was describing, but my mind refused to process it. The kind, stable father figure I had loved was dissolving before my eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. Prosecutor Davies allowed the weight of her words to settle before he continued. His voice was a gentle scalpel, carefully dissecting the past. So, after your husband's death, Mark Sterling was there for you? He was. Everywhere, my mother corrected, her voice gaining a chilling clarity. He handled the funeral arrangements. He dealt with the creditors. He told me not to worry about a thing. He was the perfect, grieving friend. She looked at the jury, her eyes pleading with them to understand. You have to realize I was in shock. I had lost my husband, my home, my business. I had a 5-year-old daughter to protect. I was drowning, and he was the only hand reaching out to save me. Or so it seemed, Davies murmured, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Tell us what happened next, Elena. He isolated me, she said. Subtly at first. He said old friends were a painful reminder of Michael, that it was better to start fresh. He convinced me to move to a new city, away from everyone I knew. He said it was for a new beginning. I see now it was to ensure I had no one to turn to but him. I could feel my own memories warring with her words. The move, the new school. I had thought it was an adventure. Mark had made it seem like a grand gesture of kindness. He controlled the finances, my mother continued. The small life insurance policy Michael left. Mark managed it for me. He said I was too fragile to deal with such things. He gave me an allowance, like a child. He paid the bills. He chose my clothes. He wore the mask of a saint, a selfless protector. But I was living in a gilded cage. Why did you marry him? Davies asked the question that was burning in my own mind. My mother's gaze fell on me, and her expression was one of profound, heartbreaking love and regret. For her, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was terrified. I was alone, with no money and a young daughter. Mark offered security. He promised to love Maya as his own. And he did. He was a good father to her. I told myself that was enough. I told myself it was the price I had to pay for her safety. The price for your silence. Davies pressed. Yes, she admitted, tears flowing freely again. The price for my silence. Mark was shaking his head, a look of theatrical disbelief on his face. He whispered something to his lawyer, who once again jumped to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this is a character assassination based on the fanciful rewriting of history by a grieving woman. It has no relevance to the slander case against Mr. Croft. Mr. Peterson, Judge Thompson said, his voice dangerously low. The character of your client is the very heart of this case. And right now, I am finding this testimony to be extremely relevant. Sit down. The lawyer sank back into his chair, defeated. The momentum had shifted completely. This was no longer Mark's trial against Julian Croft. This was my mother's trial against Mark. Davies took a deep breath, his next question a carefully aimed arrow. Elena, you told the police that your husband was in a deep depression. You supported Mr. Sterling's story that Michael's death was a suicide. Is that the truth? The courtroom held its breath. This was it. The precipice. My mother looked directly at Mark. His eyes were burning into hers, a silent, desperate threat. For a moment, I saw the old fear return. Her hands trembled. Elena, Davies prompted gently. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the fear was gone, replaced by a fire that had been smoldering for 20 years. No, she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. That was not the truth. That was his story, the story he made me tell. Then what is the truth? The truth, she said, her voice shaking with the weight of it, is that my husband was a fighter. He was broken, yes, but he would never have abandoned his daughter. He would never have left me. How can you be so sure? Because, she said, reaching into the small handbag she'd been allowed to bring to the stand. That morning, before he left with Mark, Michael gave me this. She pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper, an old letter. He told me not to open it unless something happened to him. He said it was his just-in-case letter. For years, I was too afraid to look at it. I hid it away, but I brought it with me today. Davies took the letter from her trembling hands as if it were a sacred artifact. Your Honor, I would like to enter this letter into evidence. It's a forgery, Mark roared, finally losing all composure and lunging to his feet. She's lying. That woman is insane. Mr. Sterling, you will be silent, or I will have you removed, the judge commanded, his eyes fixed on the letter. He gestured for the bailiff to take it. The bailiff handed the letter to the judge, who unfolded it carefully. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the old paper. Judge Thompson read it, his expression shifting from stern curiosity to utter shock. He read it a second time, then a third. Finally, he looked up, his gaze falling upon Mark Sterling with a cold, hard finality. He didn't say what was in the letter. He didn't have to. The truth was written all over his face. My world, my life, my entire understanding of who I was, had been built on a lie. The man I called my father wasn't my savior. He was a monster, and this courtroom was no longer a stage for his victory, but the scene of his unmasking. Judge Thompson slowly refolded the letter. He looked at my mother with a new, profound respect. Then he looked at Mark. This court, he said, his voice echoing with the weight of a terrible new reality, is in recess. Mr. Sterling, you will remain in this building under the supervision of the bailiff. You are not to go anywhere. The judge's chambers were an oasis of suffocating quiet after the storm in the courtroom. We sat in hard leather chairs that felt as unforgiving as the truth that was about to be laid bare. My mother sat beside me, no longer crying, but filled with a fragile, steely resolve. Mark and his lawyer were on the other side of the room, a tangible chasm of betrayal between us. The air was thick with 20 years of unspoken words. Judge Thompson sat behind his imposing desk, the worn letter from my father spread out before him. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked at my mother with an expression that was no longer just judicial. It was human, filled with a deep, sorrowful empathy. "Mr. Davies," the judge said, his voice heavy, "please read the contents of this letter for the record." Davies picked up the letter. The paper was so old it was nearly translucent under the harsh office lights. He began to read, and with every word, the foundation of my life turned to dust. "My dearest Elena," my father's handwriting, which I had only ever seen on the back of old photographs, began. "If you are reading this, it means I didn't come home from my meeting with Mark, and something terrible has happened. Please, do not believe it was an accident. Do not believe I would ever leave you and our little Maya by choice." I felt a sob catch in my throat. My mother reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Davies continued, his voice steady. "Mark is not the man we think he is. For weeks, I've suspected he's been moving our assets, creating shell companies. He's been bleeding the firm dry behind my back. I found the proof today. The investment deal was a sham. He's been siphoning the money for himself. I am going to confront him tonight at the bridge. He thinks we're just going for a drive. I have to believe our friendship is strong enough to survive this, that he will make it right. But if not, if I am wrong about him, know that I love you and Maya more than life itself. I would never, ever leave you." The letter ended there. It wasn't just a letter, it was a ghost's testimony. It was my father reaching across 2 decades to tell the truth. "Forgery." Mark spat, his voice hoarse. "She wrote that herself. A pathetic attempt to." "Enough." Judge Thompson slammed his hand on the desk, his voice thundering in the small room. "You will be silent, Mr. Sterling. The State Forensics Lab can verify the age of this ink and paper in a matter of hours. But I suspect I already know what they will find." He turned his gaze to my mother. "Elena," he said, his tone now gentle. "The letter explains the motive. Now, please, tell me what happened after your husband's death." And so, the story poured out of her. It was a torrent of pain and fear, held back for 20 years. She spoke of how Mark, the grieving best friend, became her shadow. How he'd shown her doctored police reports that ruled Michael's death a suicide due to overwhelming debt. How he'd helped her by taking control of the pittance that was left, all while secretly consolidating the millions he had stolen. "He was a master of quiet control," she said, her eyes distant. "He never raised his voice to me. He never had to. His threats were always veiled in kindness. It's a dangerous world out there for a single mother, Elena. You and Maya are so vulnerable. You're lucky you have me to protect you." Every word was a revelation that rewrote my childhood. The expensive private school Mark sent me to? Not a gift, but a way to indebt my mother further. The lavish vacations? A way to display his stolen wealth and parade us as his happy, rescued family. Every happy memory I had with him was now tainted, poisoned by the truth. Every birthday gift, every word of praise, every fatherly hug was a lie. A tool of his manipulation to keep my mother silent and me ignorant. "Why didn't you go to the police?" the judge asked softly. "He told me they wouldn't believe me," she whispered. "He said I had a history of emotional instability after Michael died. A history he had carefully fabricated with reports from doctors who were his friends. He said if I ever spoke out, he would prove I was an unfit mother and take Maya from me forever. I couldn't risk losing her. She was all I had left of Michael. So I stayed. I played the part of the grateful, loving wife. And every day, for 20 years, I died a little inside, living in the house of the man who destroyed my husband and stole our lives." As she finished, the room was plunged into a profound silence. I was no longer crying. A cold, hard anger was settling in my bones. I finally looked at Mark, truly looked at him, and saw him for what he was, a parasite who had fed on our family's tragedy. His charismatic mask had shattered completely. His face was contorted in a snarl of pure, narcissistic rage. "She's insane," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Every word is a lie. She was always unstable, delusional. I saved her. I gave her everything. You gave her a cage, Davies said quietly. And the man you slandered, Julian Croft? He was another partner you defrauded years later. He just happened to be the first one with the courage to fight back, to give Elena the opening she needed. Judge Thompson stood up, his face a grim mask of judgment. Mark Sterling, he began, his voice leaving no room for argument. This began as a civil proceeding, but the testimony and evidence presented here suggest a series of criminal acts of the most depraved nature. The case of Sterling versus Croft is hereby declared a mistrial. He picked up his phone. I am ordering an immediate, full-scale criminal investigation into you for fraud, conspiracy, and for the wrongful death of Michael Petrenko. You can't do this, Mark screamed, lunging forward before being restrained by the bailiff. I am a respected member of this community. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, the judge said, his voice like ice. I suggest you finally exercise it. He nodded to the bailiff. Take him into custody. He is to be held without bail pending arraignment. I watched as the man I had called Dad was handcuffed. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had praised my report cards, who had walked me to my first day of school. As they led him out of the chambers, a screaming, pathetic shell of his former self, he locked eyes with me one last time. There was no remorse in them. Only hatred. Hatred for us, for the truth, for finally being caught. In that moment, 20 years of lies came crashing down, and in the wreckage, my mother and I stood, broken, but, for the first time, free. We walked out of the judge's chambers and back into the main courtroom, which was now buzzing with the frantic energy of a story breaking. Reporters were shouting into their phones. Court officials were trying to maintain order. But I saw none of it. The world had narrowed to the space between me and my mother. As the bailiffs led Mark away, his hateful glare was the last chain to break. We were free. We left the courthouse through a side door, blinking against the harsh afternoon sun. The world outside felt alien, too bright, too loud. For 20 years, our lives had been lived in the muted tones of fear and secrecy. Now, the silence between us was not one of restraint, but of shared, staggering grief for the life that had been stolen from us. The first few weeks were a blur. We stayed with a distant cousin while the legal storm raged on. The media frenzy was relentless. The Sterling betrayal, the headline screamed. Pillar of community exposed as monster. There were interviews, depositions, and long, draining meetings with Prosecutor Davies. Through it all, my mother was a rock. The fragile, terrified woman from the witness stand was gone. In her place was Elena Petrenko, a survivor with a voice of tempered steel, patiently and precisely recounting every detail of Mark's two-decade reign of terror. The letter my father wrote was authenticated. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, all were verified as being 20 years old. It was the key that unlocked everything. Faced with the letter and my mother's unwavering testimony, Mark's empire of lies crumbled. Julian Croft's slander charges were dropped, and he, in turn, became a key witness for the prosecution, detailing the financial fraud that had ruined my father. Mark Sterling was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Michael Petrenko. The judge delivered the sentence without a flicker of emotion: life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Justice, after 20 years, had finally been served. 1 year later, the world was a different place. We had moved into a small, sunlit apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was modest, a world away from the cold luxury of Mark's mansion, but every corner of it was ours. It smelled of my mother's baking and the cheap, fresh flowers I bought every Sunday. It was the first true home I had ever known. We didn't get Mark's money. It was all seized as assets from his criminal enterprise. But we didn't want it. We had each other, and we had the truth. My mother, Elena, had become a different woman. The silence and fear had been replaced by a fierce, quiet purpose. She started a small non-profit organization from our living room, funded by a victims' restitution fund and small community donations. She called it the Michael Petrenko Project. It was a support network for women who were victims of coercive control and financial abuse. Women who, like her, had been trapped in gilded cages, silenced by powerful men. She used her experience not as a source of pain, but as a wellspring of empathy, helping others find the voice she had lost for so long. And me? I was on the cusp of my own new beginning. I had spent the year volunteering at her project, listening to the stories, and helping women navigate the complex legal system. The fire that had been lit in that courtroom had not gone out. It had become a guiding light. I was in my first year of pre-law at the local university, my application essay a story that no admissions board could ignore. One crisp autumn afternoon, my mother and I were sitting in our small living room, the late sun casting long shadows on the floor. She was on the phone, calmly talking a terrified woman through the process of filing a restraining order. I was studying for my constitutional law midterm. When she hung up, she looked at me, a soft, proud smile on her face. "You see?" she said. "That's the 5th woman this week we've helped find a safe place. Your father would be so proud of this." "He'd be proud of you, Mom," I said, my throat tight with emotion. "You're the one who survived. You're the one who's saving them." She walked over to a small wooden box on our bookshelf. Inside was the letter, his just-in-case letter. It was no longer a piece of evidence, but a treasured memento. She took it out, her fingers tracing his familiar script. "He saved me," she said softly. "He never stopped. Even after he was gone, he left the truth behind for me to find when I was finally strong enough to look for it." She looked at me, her eyes clear and bright. "And I found my strength the day I saw you in that courtroom. You were so brave. You reminded me that I was Michael Petrenko's wife and Maya Petrenko's mother. And that was a legacy worth fighting for." I knew then that our story wasn't just about a monster being unmasked. It was about the enduring power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the simple, earth-shattering power of one person daring to speak the truth. Our lives had been defined by a terrible lie, but we were going to spend the rest of our days building a future based on a beautiful, unshakable truth. How many truths lie buried in silence, waiting for one brave voice to set them free? And what could we all accomplish if we chose to listen? If this story of resilience and justice moved you, please like, subscribe, and share it. You never know who might need to hear that it's never too late to speak, and it's never too late to be heard.